Good morning, everybody. So, as I said, I'm Gerry Connolly, head of museum and exhibitions at Worthing Museum Art Gallery. So yes, I am going to go on to talk about a case study of a recent exhibition, which will open up questions that I'll address. But I'm just going to give a little background to the collection, because I think it's really important to give a background to the collections and the collection history to understand where the collections are right now and the issues that that's causing for me as a curator, and hopefully that some of this will help unravel this program, which is really great. That's the museum in all its glory, built as a Carnegie Library on the left and purpose-built museum on the right. And we're trying to take over the whole building. We're in the process of trying to get funding to redevelop the whole of the building to become a museum and stores. This, I've opened with this. It's probably one of our most famous pieces of the collection, certainly one of our earliest complete garments. And we're really proud, and obviously because of its age rarely gets out, so we haven't used it a lot on slides and presentations. But it also just gives a real introduction to the collection, because it is, as I say, one of the earliest complete garments in the collection. So the museum has acquired items of textiles since its beginning. So the museum opened in 1908, and there's evidence that there's always been costume and textile collections in the museum. But it wasn't until the 1950s, mid-1950s, that the museum was actually made a decision to develop its costume collection. It didn't have a costume collecting policy. So they were collecting costumes from anybody who was donating, pretty much, and that kind of forms the basis of the collection. And the collection expanded. Just to give an example, in 1961, the collection took in nearly 2,500 items of costume in 1 year. And that was the case through the late 50s and early 60s. So really expanded from what was not within a dress collection, but was within a textile collection into an actual dress collection in that period. But the collection itself, it's never been curated, had never been properly curated. So although those collections were developed in that period, they were developed by volunteers, supported by the then curator, who had little knowledge in the collection of textiles. His specialism was in English glass of the 1800s. But he was clearly supportive of the collection to allow that many pieces into the collection during that period. It does mean that we now have, in total within the dress and textile collection, about 40,000 pieces across all social life, but also all gender, male, female, and children's wear. The problem that we've got with our collecting policy is that I think from our one of the issues we have is that there was, because of no collecting policy, and I think particularly for childhood and for children's wear, it was accidentally collected. It was never collected as an academic or for any reference. It was usually collected, and in my experience as a curator and being offered, you kind of get that blackmailing scenario where somebody comes in and offers you this amazing thing, but in order to have this one amazing thing, you have to take 10 other objects, or you say no. And without a collecting policy, that no is really difficult. And we have improved on that. There has been a collecting policy in place for quite a number of years now, which is really helping that narrative. And having that narrative really helps us in explaining to donors that we can't, and the reasons why we can't. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes we have to lose that garment because we just can't make those commitments to taking on a whole wardrobe full of clothes because of one amazing thing in the collection. So those decisions are being made for us by the public who donate to us. So that's kind of background of the collections and understanding why the difficulties of it. This was an exhibition that we did at the beginning of the year. It was it was a last minute exhibition. It was a exhibition came out of an artist pulling out of an exhibition 2 months before the deadline of opening. So all the curators had to put together over December and January of 2021, 2022 to pull together an exhibition from the collections. And because I guess where we were in coming out of COVID, we looked at, called it the trip to Worthing, and it was, the subtext was between Downs and Sea, and that's how the town is often described as being. And it was a history of the town over its kind of roughly 200 years. So the town became a very fashionable seaside resort from the early 1900s after Princess Amelia came to stay in Worthing in the late 1800s, 1798, to recuperate. Story goes that she came to Worthing because her father didn't want her to go to Brighton. It would be too racy and she wouldn't rest. The reality of it was that the fleet were off of the coast protecting Prince in Brighton, and therefore the fleet was equidistant from Worthing as it was from Brighton. So they didn't have to protect the town of Worthing in terms of her security. So the town on the back of that became quite fashionable and developed quite rapidly through the early part of the 1800s. And the town started being laid out and turned from a very sleepy village, fishing village, hamlet, into a town, which did very well in the first quarter of the 1800s, and then completely crashed when all of the French wars ended and all of the tourists started going back to France and back on the grand tours, and everybody had moved from the land and from the sea to work in service, and suddenly those services weren't needed, so they were all left without employment. So this case study covers the story of that history, and then as tourism picked up again in the late 1800s, and that development of tourism, the coming of the train, so it narrates all of that touring of the train, and part of that was obviously very dominant was the seaside, and we show that within the collections. And it's never an afterthought for us within the museum to put children's wear in an exhibition, but it's always really difficult. They take, within big gallery spaces, they are so small, so tiny, that you need quite a lot, and we just don't have the display materials to display a lot. So we tend to show them as part of cameos within other displays within the exhibition. So that was kind of why I introduced this exhibition and understand why we were, as an organization, how we struggle and some of the issues around displaying children's wear within the museum. So I go on to talk about some of the issues that we've had over the years around collecting policy, future collecting, and care of the collections. This is a letter from Lem Bickerton. So Lem Bickerton was the curator who was in charge of the museum during the period where the collection was extensively developed, and he wrote this letter, which I mean you can't see, but I have transcribed it. So the rapidly expanding costume collection is giving me some concern, as it is also the general level of new acquisitions. It seems to me that we are accepting materials already duplicated in the collections, and so similar to add nothing of significance to the collections. I should be glad, therefore, if in future you would restrict accessions to, and he actually names female and juvenile costume and accessories prior to 1830s, and that's the only mention he makes, and the only permission he gives of for children's wear to use the collection, so it has to be prior to a point. So he was feeling in the 1960s that we had enough from the 1800s, from the late 1800s and early 20th century. And he was probably right at the time. I think what it unintentionally did was it stopped collecting in the now, and the collection has suffered from that. So the collection from the late 1960s is very weak, and we need to address those issues. So that casual memo that went out to staff had a detrimental effect on how the collection was developed through the rest of the history of the museum and today. So we are looking at some of the issues around future collecting, and we have started some projects. So our collection is completely by donation, which is really restrictive, and it's always about 25, 30 years behind, because collections come in based on people downsizing as families move out and leave home, children leave home, and then as they plan the end of life. So you're picking up all of that emotion when things are being donated. So it feeds back into those one object that you won from a box of 20 donations, because all of those emotions and the conversations that I end up having to add people that do not tell you when you're doing your degree, right? That emotional side of it, which is really interesting and really fascinating, and I wish you could capture more of it, but you just don't. If you're not taking the object in, then you kind of almost ignore that narrative, and you only collect that narrative for the object that you're accepting into the collections. We did do a project which was launched in 2019, which was to develop the collections through the 80s, 90s and noughties, but it was focused on dress, and it was focused probably on from teenagers onwards. And I think we hit it at just the wrong time. Our intention was that we would be able to engage the public, and we were working with some schools, and all of that collapsed. So we ended up doing it online and continuing the project because the funders insisted that we did. And I think the project failed on that basis, in the sense that we didn't get as many objects into the collection as we hoped to for the 80s, 90s and noughties. And the idea behind bringing the collection up to date was that we could then contemporary collect, we could collect now. And the new organisation, the new trust, which was formed in 2019 to manage the museum, has put a small budget in place for us to future collect and collecting now. One of the things that came out of the project that we did around future collecting was that we miss the nuances of fashion. We miss how people are adapting their favourite pop star, or when they can't afford the designer clothes that they're wearing. What are they doing? And all of those things are lost. And one of the things that really surprised us, there was a famous club in Worthing, and we actually put a request out to ask for Stearns, of anybody who'd worn anything to Stearns in the 1980s and early, and it was the period of the raves, so the late 80s, early 90s. We got one item in from that whole period of people in Worthing, and we know the people are there. So either they're not ready to let go of it yet, or it doesn't exist. But it really brought to light the items that are just not being collected. And so one of the things we're trying to do with the future collecting is to pick up some of those nuances across the collection. Because once we have those bases of the nuances, then as time goes on, those items will come in as part of donations that will pad out that collection and help with that narrative. So this is the display. So some of the display issues that we have, just really quickly, is they're just really difficult off the shelf to get display mannequins for our children to wear. And even the ones that do exist are just the wrong size. They just don't work. We have been doing a lot of work with our conservator to come up with some ideas. And actually it was out of this project. We've had a conservation training day a couple of months ago, and it was out of this project that we focused on children's wear. So that this project for me as a curator has brought the children's wear collection to the fore. So it's always been there. I've always been aware of it and always been, we have a brilliant collection, but I've always been a little bit hesitant around the display and interpretation of those collections. So this is just a little cashmere dress circa 1870. So this is a very early introduction to the collection. and this one is embroidered with wool roses. Just a beautiful piece in the collection. This is early and denoted by the reference. So any references that are in most of our referencing for the museum's date and then a number, and where it doesn't have a date before it, a year when it came in, it means it was catalogued before the end of the 1930s. Because once we came out of the war and started bringing the collections back to life, we started using the date system in the late 40s. And in the education, so we use a lot of children's work in the education section. It's a collaboration between the curator and the education team of what they need, what they're looking for within it. A lot of the public are really happy that it's being used. In some cases, it's just about, it went to the museum and I'm happy, job done, and they can get on, and that's their narrative and that's their future story. For us, it's really great because those objects that are in the collection that you can't handle, it's just really great to have those opportunities, and even for kids in these cases to try them on. The problem we're getting within the education, which we have a very strong education program across the whole of the conurbation between Brighton and Littlehampton on the south coast of England, is that the curriculum doesn't allow very much for use of dress when we do loan boxes, when we do education sessions, which is really difficult and really sad. So we're looking at new ways to use it within the education system. This is another little child's please, circa 1830. This community collection in 1974. It's just a nice piece from the collection, but I don't think I showed on the day we had the last session at the museum. So one of the issues we have with, as I say, is the narrative, is that object idea that it's accidental. And historically, the collections, in fact, when I started at the museum, quite a lot of the children's work collection were within the social history collection as part of childhood, rather than being in the dress collection. And we have moved those across. That didn't complete until about 2010. So we didn't start that program of work till I'd say it was around 2000 when the program of work was even recognised that it needed doing. So we started bringing that forward. So it now is acknowledged as being part of the collection. And I think there's something around that narrative around how it came into the collection. We segregate our dress collection into male, female, juvenilia, and infant. And I think it's that juvenilia word that causes problems within collecting within museum collections, because a lot of the costumes went into our juvenilia collection, which is toys, dolls, and all of those objects that we have in abundance as well. I think there's a lot of confusion from our experience of, because of those crossovers within our collecting. I think we have a lot of domestic social craft in the collection because we collect dress rather than actually ever collecting domestic craft. And I think the children's wear is the same. We never necessarily intended to collect it. But I think the strength of it, out of that, is that actually we have got a lot of the ordinary. We've got a lot of those objects that were nappies, that were baby grows, and all of those things that might not have been accepted, but because they went into the juvenilia connection, they were in this position. The other issue we have, which all of these workshops really help, is identifying children's wear, and that confidence to identify, and especially when you have a doll collection. You think that should be easy, and actually it's not. There are quick, I recognize there are quick references that you can make, but some of them are just really difficult to identify between that kind of doll size dress and what was for a child, a young baby. So it's really difficult. But we don't give up. We have just opened a new research centre, which has been really successful. It was planned to be open in 2020, but we have now just opened it. And we're starting to accept, in fact, this group was the first group that visited the new research centre back in April. And we've since had university students in. What's really interesting, and I've worked directly with the collection, started as a volunteer in 2005. I could probably count on one hand the amount of times we've had inquiries to research the children's work collection. And I know we promote our collection a lot, and maybe we need to look at our narrative of how we are letting people know that we have this amazing dress collection, and the public interpretation of that word dress collection and what they think we actually have, and think that it is just for adults and not just for children. And that whole narrative that these projects and being part of this will bring for us is that interpretation and that confidence of interpretation and understanding how to interpret these objects. And we are starting as wider within the museum to look at decolonializing the collections, but also about the words that we use in terms of equity, diversity, gender, all of those things generally across as part of the Museum Next project that the museum has just involved in. And we've also just got involved with the Museum Association, just put together a cohort of museums to put together a tool book of how to decolonialize collections. So we're part of that cohort. So that would be really interesting to kind of internal reflection on how we look at our collections, and then how that toolkit is put together to be rolled out across regional museums throughout the UK, which is really interesting. So that's me done. So.